Get everything set up here. Emily, if you could give me a thumbs up that we're in full screen and everything's good to go. Great. Okay. Well, again, welcome everybody. My name's Dr. Jaimie Rubin. I'm really excited to be here. I am from Premier Sports Psychology, and we're a group mental health and sport performance practice in the Minnesota, Minneapolis area, St. Paul area. We work, as Emily sort of alluded to earlier, we work with individuals, everything from youth all the way through pros, as well as teams and organizations. I know a number of folks in the crowd are from institutions, universities, or colleges that we also work at, and we're excited to see you here. I'm excited to see you all here. Just to give a little bit more information about how we work, as of right now, since the pandemic has started, we work primarily through telehealth. So we do have access still to student athletes and our individual clients, and they have access to us through telehealth services. And we also have online mental skills, mental training, and performance programming through Premier. So just want to let you all know that, and that's kind of how we've been working through this pandemic. I know your work has all changed, so I want to let you know how our work has changed. Okay, so I want to get started here just by giving you a little bit of an overview of what we'll be doing here today. Today, I hope that we can start a little bit with some mindfulness, giving ourselves a chance to check in on some particularly important aspects of what we might be talking about overall. Then we're going to move into talking about some stats around mental health, around your student athletes, around mental health particular to the pandemic, and everything that's been going on over the last 6 or 9 months here. Then we'll move into talking about generally stress and mental health, sort of why we got to this place of mental health, or mental health concerns that we're seeing in student athletes today and throughout this pandemic. And then also what mental health really looks like, or what you should be all looking for. I know that was a particular interest of everybody coming onto the call today. And then I hope to get into really what I think might be the most powerful section of this webinar today, and really changing the conversation around mental health, really giving you all the skills that you need to change the conversations on many levels. And finally, we're going to wrap things up with some more mental minutes, or some more mindful minutes, I should say, and some team talks and some discussions and Q&A. And the reason I put this out there, it's really important. We talk to our student athletes, and we talk to all performers really about knowing where you are, where you need to be, and how to get there. And I hope that today we can do all of those things around mental health. Okay. So I want to start us off, again, like I said, I think it's really important that we start off with some mindfulness. And there's pretty amazing research out there on the impact of practicing things like gratitude, self-compassion, externalization, hopefulness, and instilling hope, both on the mental health side of things and the performance side of things. And what I mean by that is mental health exists on a continuum. And these practices, along with mindfulness, work on all ends, or all ends of that continuum, in restoring and maintaining mental health, as well as enhancing your mental performance and optimizing your mental skills in order to perform. And so I encourage you all to be mindful not only of the content that gets shared today, but also of the exercises that you yourself are going to do, including this one, as they're also powerful for you to continue to do on your own, as a coach, as a person, with your staffs and with your student athletes. As I said, in order to work for practicing best efforts at restoring, maintaining, and really optimizing and enhancing mental health and wellness. So, I'm in a Zoom room full of coaches and athletic administrators, and I imagine a number of you have heard of work by Jeff Jansen. And there's a story that he's told about a Navy fighter pilot in Vietnam, who after 75 successful missions, he was saving a lot of folks, but he was unfortunately shot down and captured for a number of years. He was later released, and a number of years later, actually after that, while he was eating in a restaurant, a man recognized him because he was the sailor who packed his parachute. And that Navy pilot continued on to really reflect. And he began to realize that not only his own life, but the lives of so many others were truly reliant, not on his work, but on the person who packed his parachute. And he began to practice gratefulness as a result of this, and gratitude as a result of this experience. And so where I want us to start in terms of our first mindful minute is just to take 30 seconds for you all to sit, maybe even close your eyes, and just think about who has packed your parachute this week. I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about. Maybe it's somebody that you weren't thinking about before that you don't always see. Maybe it's somebody who you always see and they just did something that you don't typically take the time to recognize, but that's really sort of life-saving, or allows you to be successful, allows you to enhance yourself both personally and professionally. So as I said before, there are a number of skills, including practicing gratitude like we're doing right now, as well as externalization. So I do want to give a moment or two, if anybody feels brave enough to unmute themselves and maybe give an example or give who packed their parachute. And if not, we can also externalize in other ways, not just by speaking, but by writing. And so I encourage you to take a few seconds, and I'll give a few seconds, to use the chat to just sort of throw in there who you thought of and what they did to pack your parachute. A few more seconds to see if anybody's brave enough. Anybody want to announce to folks who's really packed their parachute this week? And if not, feel free to.
I'll go.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Sisson. I'm the athletic director with St. Mary's University, and I would say a couple things. Obviously, all going through some difficult times here the last 7-8 months and things like that. I would just say on a day-to-day, just my wife, my children, and I would say just kind of more recently, actually one of the other ADs in our league, just Jason Verdugo, just kind of talked to him the other day, and just again, all our ADs in our league are fantastic and just willing to pick up the phone and mentor and talk and just chat. So I would just say yeah, briefly those few have been good.
That's great. Brian, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I hope that for all of you, maybe just that moment of either listening to Brian or listening to yourself, and checking in on who you're grateful for, or what's something that you're grateful for, really helps shift your attention and shift your mood as a result. And we're gonna go into one more mindful minute here. And I wanna shift our focus now more into self-compassion. And so when we think about self-compassion, I know we have a lot of preconceived notions about self-compassion, but really self-compassion is much more realistic than it is optimistic or idealistic, okay? It's truly engaging your curiosity to become fully aware and develop a true understanding of yourself, your actions, and the circumstances that you're in or the circumstances you're facing without judgment. So I want us to practice that right here for another minute, just by giving yourself a moment to acknowledge whose parachute you may have packed this week. And I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about it. I'd love to see some up in the chat if you feel so inclined. And seeing some things in the chat from our last mindful minute. It's great to see. I know we serve so many folks and we often don't give ourselves the acknowledgement of it. Would anybody like to share with the rest of the group whose parachute they may have packed this week? No, that's okay too. Okay, well, if you think of it, or if you'd like to share, I encourage you to use the chat. Externalizing that way can be really powerful. Okay, we're going to shift away from mindfulness and get into the stats. And what I want to talk about in this section is really what we know about student athlete mental health in 2020. So what I have up for you is the NCAA study that was done back in the spring. And they surveyed around 37,000 student athletes from all different divisions, all different sports. And what they're really looking for is how this pandemic has impacted those student athletes, both physically and mentally. And the results were pretty powerful. Mental health concerns, I know you can see some of the findings here, but mental health concerns, I think some that I want to highlight, mental health concerns were amongst the highest of those respondents of color, as well as those whose families were facing economic issues, or they were living alone. I think for many folks on this call, you could probably acknowledge also that what was found is that college seniors reported a sense of loss at 1.5 times higher than those underclass folks, than their underclass teammates. And unfortunately, overall, in most circumstances or most instances, the rates of mental health concerns were actually up at around 150 to 250% higher than they normally are. So it was quite the overhaul, quite the shock, and this has been quite the stressor, if not multiple stressors. And we're seeing that in student athlete mental health. As you can see here, I think another important stat is that 50% reported feeling so depressed that it has been difficult to function constantly or most every day. And so that's a lot of student athletes really struggling. And we'll talk a little bit later about what are the most common diagnoses or mental health concerns that we're seeing. But there's another stat, or there's another finding that I do want to highlight that's really important. It's that 82% of the respondents, so 82% of student athletes that responded to this survey reported feeling positive or very positive about the support they were receiving from their coaches. So wow, that's fantastic. You all were doing that. I am sure you're already doing that, and they really felt it. And so what I'm hoping really today is that we can continue to enhance that and bring that number up even more. I know it has been difficult, not just for the student athletes, but for coaches, staff, administrators, athletic trainers as well. And so as this goes on, whenever we talk about, or whenever you hear me going forward talking about stressors and mental health, that includes your stress and mental health as well. So it's important to keep in mind that that may have been 82% because that was the most you could give then, and that's okay. We want to keep that going. We want to keep that stat up there and higher even. There are a couple other findings that I want to highlight from this really profound study that they did. So here we have some more stats highlighting more experiences in particular of our Black and Brown Latinx student athletes, particularly along the lines of nutrition, access, family life, fear of health and risk exposure. They were reported at higher rates for those Black and Latinx student athletes than of white student athletes. It's really important that we kind of pay attention to those unique stressors and needs of those student athletes. And so I want to highlight that here because they, just like they do for everybody, but for these student athletes, they contribute greatly to their mental health, their well-being, and their performance. And so we have to pay attention to the folks that we're really serving on a unique level. Additionally, we all know that significant changes in academics were made across the board, whether you went in person at any time or are still doing partial in person. There's a lot of online coursing, a lot of Zoom classes. I know you all are having basically Zoom practices, Zoom strength sessions, I know. And that big change turned out to be a big challenge for student athletes, and they're still working through that. And I know I've heard that a lot in the position that I'm in. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that. And I say really all of this, or I bring all these pieces, the academics, the health, the family life, their sport, and their mental health. I bring all those pieces together because they truly make up the people you're working with and serving, and they contribute to their sense of safety and stability and certainty, and therefore their mental health. And so you all, as you can see here on the left, I want to highlight this other finding. Respondents generally would look to their coaches as their primary source of information on both physical and mental well-being, as well as to help maintain their social connection. In terms of academic support, career planning, and financial assistance, they reported that they're really looking to the athletic department overall. Maybe that's other personnel and administrators. But you all have a lot of power, clearly. They're looking at you like that. But that's also a lot to take on. And we can hold both. You all are equipped to hold both. But what would make it easier for you was if you felt like you were truly equipped with the tools, both informationally that I hope to provide, meaning signs, the symptoms, and your resources, as well as the applied skills, communication, listening, and referring to really service your student athletes and their mental health and well-being. And also, I should have said this before or at the start, but hopefully we'll have time at the end for questions. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll have Emily and Sarah check on that chat, but also I'll get those questions later. And again, if you don't take to your question later today, please feel free to shoot me an email later, and hopefully we can have a conversation to extend this further. Apologize for not saying that earlier. Okay, let's keep going here a little bit. So let's talk about sort of what got us here, or why we think we're here, and what we're seeing, okay? So what we're going to talk about next is the contributing factors to those signs, contributing factors to mental health or the changes in mental health overall, as well as mental health concerns that we're seeing. And, you know, I love this, this graphic here on the left. It says, if you can't see it, it says, it turns out it wasn't the giant asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It was the stress about the giant asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. And I love this depiction really of stress, because a lot of times we think that stress is the detriment to our health. But, you know, what we now know is that our perception of stress is incredibly impactful on how we manage it, and also our mental health and our overall well-being. And in fact, there was a study, and I love this study, there was a study of 30,000 people, and they did this study longitudinally, so over 8 years, asking those folks about how much stress they experienced in the last year, and then also asking them if they believe stress is harmful to their health. So they did both of those questions. And then of course they went on and they used death records to check on who died in that year and in the subsequent years. And what was amazing is what they found is that people who stated that they experienced a lot of stress had a 43% increased chance of dying. However, what's really critical about this study is that that was only true for those who thought that stress was harmful to their health. And so I just think that really speaks to your perception of stress being critical to how stress impacts you. And as we go forward in talking about stress, I want you to think about that for yourself and for your student athletes as well. Both what is the stress and the stressors they're taking on, how long they're holding it, what's the impact that has, but also what's your perception of those stressors and how is that impacting you? So the stress threshold. So what we know is that the mounting up of stressors and the experience of prolonged stress will often result in mental health disorders, mental health concerns, symptomology that really impacts a person's ability to function on a daily basis and get their needs met. And so for folks who experienced mental health concerns prior to the pandemic, as well as for those who did not experience mental health concerns prior to the pandemic, both as a result of what we call the stress threshold and the piling up of stressors throughout this pandemic, and I'll talk a little bit about the uniqueness of those stressors, that both were at risk, increased risks for resulting changes for mental health concerns. And that all has to do with the result of major changes in your routine, just generally loss, and that could be loss of that routine, loss of social connection, loss of autonomy, loss of identity, in resources, changes and loss of resources, disconnection, socially disconnection from resources, disconnection from your coaches, your sport, etc. And also loss of your typical stress management strategies and outlets. And so what you might notice, or what you might know about yourself, I should say, is as coaches and administrators, as high performers, your student athletes as high performers, particularly at institutions in both the UMAC and MIAC, I know they're exceedingly high performers academically, athletically, and socially. And so they're likely, and so are you likely, to know that you're really good at dealing with stress, right? Student athletes deal with stress on an everyday basis all the time, and that stress could be inside athletics, inside academics, their social lives, just the demands in general. But this pandemic has proven to change that. And I think what we think is that it really has to do with the piling up of losses. So the uniqueness of some of these stressors. And so when you have loss of identity combined with loss of boundaries, right? You all know this, some of you are sitting in your homes right now. You're not in your offices. And so there's loss of boundaries between where is home and work, where is family and team. There's also loss of autonomy. What kind of schedule can I have? What kind of choices can I make? Your student athletes are experiencing significant loss of identity and loss of their socialization or their regular routines, as are you. And so we can see how both the piling up of losses, the prolonged nature of those losses, as well as their perception of stress really plays into how much of an impact and how they can handle that stress and how that's been different now. And so these stressors, as you can see, are based on a tremendous amount of loss, and that's going to impact you differently. And it's going to require that you manage that differently. Bringing it back, I think, to think about some of those BIPOC student athletes and how they have been adjusting or maintaining their mental health throughout this pandemic, you can also notice now that the number of stressors that might pile up more quickly or more heavily, if you're thinking about other stressors that they might be managing, some things we've talked about, but also holding them longer, they might be meeting their threshold at a much quicker rate and for a much longer period of time. And so once you reach that threshold, that's going to impact your mental health in a way that's going to really contribute to your ability to function on a daily basis. So what we're really seeing in terms of what we've noticed coming into our offices or across the board in research that has been done since this pandemic started is a huge increase in these particular disorders. So anxiety, depression, we're hearing a lot more about eating disorders, folks struggling with eating, folks struggling with nutrition, increase in trauma and trauma-related disorders, as well as sleep difficulties. And sleep difficulties, of course, relate directly to anxiety, depression, eating disorders. But they also are in their own category, depending on what kind of level of sleep concern there is. And another concern that we're noticing, or another change we're noticing, is really in substance use and abuse. And I think that directly relates to the anxiety and depression that folks are feeling. And again, going back to the stress threshold and what's really contributing to us meeting our stress threshold is their loss of ability to cope in the same ways that they're used to. And so they're finding new ways to cope, new ways to distance, new ways to disconnect, new ways to feel better. And some of that, unfortunately, has been found in substance use. And I think when we see these mental health concerns, or you see these mental health disorders, thinking back again to the stress threshold, we want to really note that that loss is now also combined with the anxiety or the depression or the trauma that comes out as a result of a combination of specific stressors like the pandemic, social injustice, the political environment that they're in right now, academic concerns, as well as fears around health and wellness. So those are important factors to consider as to why we're seeing this increase in these particular disorders as opposed to some other disorders. So now what I want to get into is talking about identifying concerns. So, knowing the warning signs and symptoms, and I know all of you, it's likely that a lot of you have spent some time, whether that's in past webinars, or you've gotten pamphlets, or you've already reached out and spoken to your student athletes, or you talk about mental health a lot already. It's likely that you're aware of the fact that knowing the warning signs and symptoms of each of those disorders that I just mentioned is really important. And in fact, I am going to provide you all with a packet that sort of lists them all out per each of these disorders that I mentioned earlier. And you should probably get that packet after this webinar from either Sarah or Emily or any of your admin staff who it's being given to. And so hopefully that'll make you feel like you have a good working list of those, the typical warning signs of each of those disorders and what that looks like in student athletes, what you might be noticing and identifying. But for today, though, what I really want to shift our focus to is the communication and awareness skills that are actually needed to truly identify and take action when those warning signs are coming up. As coaches, you all are the ultimate communicators, right? But when it comes to mental health, and we'll talk about this a little later too, it's often that there's a level of discomfort and uncertainty, not necessarily of the warning signs themselves, but in the communication and the noticing of differences in the skills that are needed to identify and then take action that really actually keeps coaches and administrators from engaging in the conversation altogether. And I really want to change that. So like I said, you will have a packet. And in fact, on our next slide, we're going to look really briefly at some key identifiers or typical warning signs and symptoms. But then we're really going to spend some time and move into the skills that are needed to communicate, to ask the right questions, to listen, and to notice changes. So as you can see, there's a pretty, what seems like a comprehensive list, and I hope this doesn't scare too many of you. But there are certain things that, yes, of course, we want to be aware of. If you're hearing self-harming behaviors or seeing self-harming behaviors, if you're hearing suicidal ideation, if you're seeing or hearing a tremendous weight loss or gain, if you're noticing major changes in academic performance, if you're hearing or noticing somatic issues like gastrointestinal issues or headaches, loss of interest, and changes in fatigue. And even as I go on to list some of the ones that we really want to pay attention to, I notice myself even saying, and as I've listed it here, this is really about noticing changes in energy level, changes in fatigue, changes in their appetite and eating, changes in their substance use, not just substance use to begin with, or not just the weight that they're at to begin with, or not just their emotions to begin with, but also changes in their ability to regulate, changes in their fatigue. And I know we're going to notice this a lot because of the pandemic, but we want to really pay attention to what do we know about our student athletes, specifically on an individual level, even on a team level. What do we know about their engagement? How are they typically acting with us? How have they been acting with us, not just in the past before the pandemic, but also through the beginning of the pandemic, so that we can be much better at noticing changes when they arise, because those changes are going to be the key sort of gateway into whether that's going to open up a conversation or whether it's important to recognize that that is a warning sign as opposed to a unique quality of that individual. So hopefully this list just sort of gets your mind running on symptoms or things that we know about generally across the board for mental health. So these aren't particular to, these are existent in many mental health disorders, so they're not particular to any one. But they're also ones that we notice most definitely with student athletes, folks at the collegiate level, and that we've noticed over through the pandemic and before the pandemic. And again, you'll be getting more information on some of those with a packet later after this webinar. So I'm going to shift right ahead here into the part that I'm really excited about bringing into this webinar and hopefully changing, in a way of hopefully changing the conversation overall. And as I said earlier, one of the #1 concerns that we hear or things that we notice with folks, coaches, administrators, athletic trainers, personnel, even teammates, so even your student athletes, is that it's their discomfort and uncertainty. It's really the fear or the lack of knowledge of resources and the skills that they have, their concern about what they might say or what they might hear or what they might miss, and what they're going to be able to do about it, that actually keeps them from having the conversation altogether. And that's valid. You know, this is heavy stuff. It's scary. It's sometimes uncertain, or it's always uncertain. But with student athletes looking to you all, and I'm thinking back to that quote and one of the findings from that study, with them looking to you all and relying on you all regularly in the way that they do, and I'm sure you all are taking that on and thinking about that a lot. I hope that in this next section, what we can do with that is really equip you with what's needed, or at least to get you started on what you're going to get together for yourself to practice the skills that are needed to feel both comfortable, but also more compelled on a proactive and a reactive level at discussing and supporting your student athletes' mental health. And I have this little quote here that I like to say: what feels reactive today will be proactive tomorrow. And, you know, when we leave this webinar, it might feel like everything's reactive. I learned about this from Dr. J or from Dr. Jaimie. And so now I want to talk about this with all of my student athletes, or I heard this from my student athletes, so I need to react right away, or this happened in the news or on campus, and so I want to react right away. And that can sometimes feel unsettling. Why am I reactive? I don't want it to feel like reactive to them. I don't want to feel like I'm just putting a Band-Aid on it. But what I want you to encourage you all to do is take those steps anyway, because what you do that's reactive today, which by the way, reactivity is sometimes needed, but what you do that's reactive today, in the end, is really going to shift the conversation altogether. It will then turn into not just the only conversation, but the first of many. And so it will turn out to be proactive tomorrow. So let's talk about the keys that I see for changing the conversation. Okay, and I've broken this down into 5 keys. And that first key is really making it a part of everyday conversation. Okay, so make it a topic that you discuss with your teams. Talk about overall wellness, and that means physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, financial, academic, self-care. Bring all these topics into the discussion so that when you go to have either more direct or more intentional, more specific, more serious conversations around mental health, around a concern that you're noticing, it's a part of your team and your own language. So I want you to do that openly and repeatedly. Check in. You can even check in on somebody's emotional and mental well-being. And you can do this in group meetings, have a group check-in, ask them specifically, where is your emotional well-being right now? Mentally, where's your status, where you're at? And in addition to that, I have some other ideas about bringing up articles, right? Bringing up podcasts and movies. I know we all talk about Netflix. I know we all talk about documentaries, the things that are the most amazing things you ever saw. And your teammates or your teams, your student athletes, they're talking about it. So bring that into the conversation. Talk about a podcast you just listened to. Have them listen to it. Share something you learned. Have you all watch the same documentary together and have a conversation. And also talk about the resources. So we're going to talk a little bit later about plans and resources, but I want to encourage you that changing the conversation is about continually bringing this up. So like I said, repeatedly and openly talk about mental health resources, whether they're on your campus or they're more global, and not just in the intro meeting, not just in the time where you bring in the academic success counselor and you bring in the sports psychologist if you have one, or you bring in the athletic trainer to meet your team and to introduce themselves and talk about the service, but bring it up again. Bring it up consistently so that they know where those resources are. And they also know that when you talk to them about those resources, it's not about passing the buck. It's about understanding their full well-being and mental health overall. Okay, so that's the first key in changing the conversation around mental health. And I think if we're looking for the buzzword here, this is really going to change destigmatizing. This is really going to destigmatize mental health for your students, your teams, and for your campus overall. The next key, I think, in changing the conversation is being direct and intentional. You do not have to be secretive or beat around the bush or sneak up on somebody's mental health in order to ask them about it, okay? Statistics actually show that those struggling with mental health, especially student athletes and at the collegiate level, show that 1 in 5 folks that are struggling with mental health, only 1 in 5 folks, I should say, reach out. So it is on you in some ways to be direct and intentional about how you address mental health with your student athletes. And you can directly ask, how are you holding up? What is taking up most of your headspace right now? Who have you been connecting with over the last few days? How's your sleep been? And the other way of going about that, especially if you're noticing changes, is I've noticed this change. You haven't been yourself lately. I'm concerned, expressing concern in that direct and intentional way. Can we talk about how you're holding up? What you might notice about most, if not all of those questions, is they're pretty open. They leave room for the student athlete to answer, and we want to give them autonomy. But when we're not direct and want to give them autonomy, then they usually answer with one-word answers. If we can be direct and ask specifically about things while also leaving open space, and we'll talk about how to listen best a little bit later, but if we can do those 2 things in a really direct and intentional way, then you're going to get closer with your student athletes to really making it accessible for them to talk to you about their mental health. And once they can talk to you about it, the reason I'm talking about changing the conversation is because once they can talk about it, then we can start noticing even more changes. And I know one of the things that came up when we were talking about planning this webinar was how that's different in pandemic time. When you're not seeing your student athletes at practice every day, when you're not able to notice changes in their body, or not able to notice changes in their attendance at class, or in their efforts at practice, or in their performances. So talking to them about it is going to be a major mode or a major deliverer for how you can extend the conversation and notice changes. And so that's why I'm spending a good amount of time talking about changing the conversation, being direct and intentional. So there's a little side note here too, particularly when it comes to suicide and self-harm. You really want to be direct and clear. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Have you had thoughts about that? I know for a lot of you, even that question is difficult to listen to, let alone ask yourself, even say it in your head. And so it's important that we start taking the time to practice questions like that out loud. Other ways of saying things, it could be, I noticed, and right now we're on Zoom, so it might not be able to happen, but just thinking about self-harm, I noticed the cuts that I see on your X body part, and I want to talk to you more. Can you tell me more about how they got there? In addition, when they say things like, when you hear student athletes and you're having conversations with them and they say things like, it would be better if I wasn't here, or it'll be better when it's all over, follow up. Okay, so when you start to be direct and intentional, you might get more direct and intentional answers. And it's really important, particularly with suicide and self-harm, to follow up and ask them things like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by not being here? What do you mean by when it's all over? That's a key in getting student athletes to know that you're hearing them, but also to open up about what they really mean and what they're signaling. I know I actually have one student athlete in particular in my mind who, that student athlete had expressed suicidal ideation in the past, and it was something we were consistently checking in on, and they made a comment about not being here anymore, and I specifically asked them what they meant, and they said when they went home for winter break. This was a number of years ago, so they were sort of traveling home for winter break, but it's important that we follow up because we don't really know what they're saying by that, and other times it might be important to follow up because they are indicating suicidal ideation or self-harm. So next down the list here, we have placing value and focus on listening, practicing emotional regulation, and knowing your resources and having a plan. Those are keys to changing the conversation, and these next three we're going to talk about a little bit further now. So I want to talk about listening, and I specifically stated that listening is a performance. And what I mean by that is that it's made up of a number of skills that have to be practiced, it has to be honed, they have to be integrated, they have to be smooth, and then they have to be executed. Okay, so you're all coaches of performances, and listening is a performance as well. So speaking about this first key, and I've again broken this down into 5 key pieces of listening. The first key here is body language, and this looks different on Zoom, as I already mentioned. It looks different in text, it sounds different on the phone. So the key that I want or the tip that I want to give you all, I should say, on how we change or how we grow this particular skill is ask those around you what makes them feel like you're engaged, whether that's through Zoom, through text, or through the phone, because that's the way that we're primarily communicating right now. So those body language cues and those things that you were noticing and that they were noticing with you when you were in person aren't necessarily there anymore. So it's time to reassess. Go back to your student athletes or your family or the folks you talk to, your administrators, your other staff, your assistant coaches, etc., and ask them really what makes them feel like you're engaged so that you can start producing that more often. The next key is empathy, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from Brene Brown in just a minute. The next skill that's a big part of listening is reflective listening. And what that really means is reflecting back what you've heard, okay? Reflecting specifically back what you've heard from your student athlete with validation and normalization of their experience. The key here is to know and remember that being seen and feeling heard is powerful in itself. And so if you can reflect back an emotion, or if you can reflect back the experience that they've shared with you, that is going to open the doors to more conversations, whether it's about mental health, whether it's about an experience they've had recently, how they're feeling overall. So a key in listening is going to be reflect back what you've heard, and again, with validation and normalization of their experience. And validation is this next key here. And what that really is simply the act of understanding, okay? It's recognizing and affirming their thoughts, feelings, and sensations, their experience overall. First, we have to recognize it. So that might be in what we do sort of internally in our mind. We recognize that those are their thoughts or those are their feelings. And then we reflect back to them. So it's kind of a combination of both. We reflect back to them those thoughts and those feelings with affirmation. And I just want to point out, by the way, because sometimes this gets misconstrued, is that validation is seeing. It is not necessarily agreeing. It's talking about, wow, that sounds like it was really painful. I hear you, I value you, I see you, I understand the experience of sadness or pain that you're having. I can hear it, I can see it. Without saying, I agree with your whole story, okay? And this final key piece of listening, this key skill for listening, is emotional regulation. And I brought this up earlier when I talked about the discomfort that we feel around mental health and that conversation. And I just want to say to you all, emotional regulation is hard. Mental health is hard. Having these conversations is really hard. It's even just talking about the topic sometimes. So when I gave, that tip of sort of bringing it up in team meetings or having it be an assignment or sharing a podcast and listening to it all together, sometimes just the topics, they bring up emotions for your student athletes, and they bring up emotions and sensations in our bodies that motivate us to protect and find safety, okay? And in a lot of ways, sometimes that looks like seeing the conversation as a threat, and therefore your brain just telling you got to get out, okay? And that getting out could look like, and we see this a lot, filling the space, giving advice, or doing a lot of advice giving, actually. Needing to be right, minimizing, those are things we really want to avoid, minimizing their experience. We want to be validating their experiences. Telling your own story can sometimes get in the way. Passing the buck, right? Just sort of handing them off to a resource. I know we all want to refer in the right ways, but handing them off to a resource without doing the work at connecting with them and making them feel safe and comforted along the way, really aligning with them at the same time. That can look like you're trying to regulate your emotions, or you're trying to protect yourself and save yourself from this threat. And again, not starting the conversation to begin with. So for you all, I want to really push you all to learn the breathing techniques, the self-soothing techniques, the skills that you need, as well as knowing that the skills that you need to regulate during these conversations, and knowing that you don't have to be a blank slate. You don't have to be a hard shell that's not allowed to feel. And this is, again, a little bit going back to our perceptions of how we should be and how that impacts our stress. We feel like we should be just a blank slate, not have any emotions, be able to capture everything they're feeling and not feel sad and not feel empathy. When in actuality, we're allowed to have those feelings. And sometimes expressing that we're there with them is really going to help make a difference for them. And so now I want to particularly highlight empathy as a skill. And so we're going to take a minute here, or a few minutes here, to listen to the master on empathy, really, Brene Brown. I think you're really going to find a lot. We won't spend really much time talking specifically about what was said in the video, but I think you're going to find it really powerful. And hopefully it's a good jumpstart into how you practice empathy as a skill.
So what is empathy, and why is it very...
Sorry, can I just ask, are we having volume for all of you? Do we have a thumbs up from somebody?
Would you be able to turn it up a little bit?
A little bit? Sure. I'm actually at my highest. Not sure.
Does it work?
Okay.
Captions, maybe?
Okay, yep. I can absolutely put on closed captions, yep. Oh, let's see if it works. Well, we'll see.
different than sympathy. Okay. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Powerful, right? So hopefully in there you saw not only give you some tips, not only on how to practice and have conversations with empathy, but also some of the other skills that we talked about, the reflective listening you heard in some of the statements that she made, the validating, the really aligning with the person when they're having that conversation and they're sharing that with you. And hopefully if you focus on these skills, honestly, you'll feel more comfortable just having the conversation to begin with. And I want to reiterate that the reason I'm spending so much time on the skills of having the conversation is because it's only one piece of the puzzle to know that mental health exists, and then another piece of the puzzle to notice, but a bigger piece, especially right now, is to be able to connect with your student athletes on it, because you're not going to be able to notice as much as we used to be able to notice. We're just not with them in the same way. And so I encourage you, that's why I focused on this so much. Because we can know a lot, but the doing part is going to be really important to help your student athletes really feel supported and feel like they're supported also in their journey of their help and their health and getting help towards improving their mental health, or taking care and compassion towards their mental health. And so that leads me into this this last piece here. I know I sent last key to changing the conversation is really knowing your resources and also knowing more resources. So it exists on two levels: your resources and your plan on your campus, as well as on a broader scale. Okay, because we're going to need to know both to really feel like we have that in our pocket. You know, this is a room of people who make a living literally on the balance between comprehensive preparation, right? Knowing your opponent, knowing your team, scouting reports and video and all that, analytics, etc. And knowing that you have the skill in an intense game to make critical game time decisions. And that's what we're really describing here. And we talked about game time decisions earlier a bit when we were discussing, you know, what questions to ask. You know, expressing empathy and practicing emotional regulation. Those are all game time decisions. That's in the conversation as we're heading into it, okay? But now what we need to focus on or refocus back on is the preparation that's needed in order to, again, be effective both proactively and reactively. What you've done beforehand to set this up for your teams and for yourself, and how you can react readily. And when needed, the reason this is really important too is because when it's needed, we want you to be comfortable encouraging those student athletes, even your staff and yourself, to reach out those additional and higher levels of support that may be needed. And that's usually about knowing that they exist, knowing who they are, and building relationships with them, knowing the who's, the where's, and the how's of those resources. And I have worked and I continue to work on a number of college campuses and universities, both in this area and across the country. And they all have a variety of these types of departments and staffs, okay? And so I just given you a couple of them here. Make a list. Go onto your website, make a list of the staff, the personnel at those places, write down their numbers, okay? Connect with your admin about who they already know as the staff connects. If you have liaisons in certain departments based on what kind of athletic department you have. You know, I know there are some athletic departments that have certain academic liaisons or counseling center liaisons or of staff that's specific for you all. So know who they are and then get to know them, build a relationship with them. When we can go back in person, go to their offices, call meetings, have them come to your offices and your staff or your student athletes, meet them more on their turf and on your turf. And again, like I said, know the where's, the when's, the how's, okay? So that you can get them the support they need for a higher level of care. So that's why I have here first, you know, when we're referring for mental health, we're talking about connecting with staff such as our athletic medicine staff, knowing the crisis lines, our counseling center, and campus safety, but also knowing the support spaces where your student athletes can truly feel seen and heard. I know you all are doing that for your student athlete, but there are identities that they hold, there are hopes that they have, there are needs that they need to be met, that you may not be filling, you may not want to fill. So knowing the spaces where they can gain the support and that can be filled is really important. And those can look like academic success centers. They can look like multicultural life. They can look like, support groups, BIPOC community support groups, LGBTQ plus community support groups, spiritual life, res life. And for those administrators, as well as coaches on the call, creating a crisis safety and reporting plan is really important. That's going to be very specific to you all, knowing who the personnel is that your coaches need to contact so that they know what they can do in an emergency situation or even an urgent situation. Getting that all written out and in everybody's office and have everybody be super aware of what's the plan and how can we protect and keep our student athletes best safe and get them the support that they need. That's really something that I would encourage you all to do if you don't have it already. And again, like I said, on the next level, knowing more resources. Okay, so those are on a global and national, level, and having those readily available to your student athletes, sharing it with them consistently and constantly, sharing it with them, generally speaking, but also when you're in those conversations where it might be needed. Okay, so we're going to close up a little bit with a couple mindful minutes here, and we're going to shift into externalization. And for our externalization, it's really important. I think it's a unique experience right now that the UMAC and the MIAC coaches have all come together. And one of the things that was expressed to me as a real concern is how are we fostering and facilitating connection and positivity? How are we motivating our student athletes and engaging them throughout this pandemic and going forward, especially with winter break coming up? And so there's never been a more unique experience than to have an enormous amount of athletic directors, enormous amount of coaches of all levels and other staff and personnel that are working and have already started doing this. So I want to really highlight that and take this opportunity to get you all to leave here with really a list of what you can do going forward. And so we're going to send you into breakout groups for just 3 minutes. Okay, so this is about sharing what is one strategy that you have used with your team that has been helpful in fostering and facilitating those things that we talked about earlier, that connection and positivity. Just share one strategy. If you have to explain it, great. You're going to be in groups of somewhere between 4 to 7, something like that. And so you're only going to have 3 minutes. Share those. Hopefully you can take a minute to write them all down and you get some good ones, in your pocket. So let's break out into those groups for just about 3 minutes here. And I think, I don't know if I have to stop share for you to do that.
I'm opening them now, so people should
Great.
be able to join them.
Okay. Again, it's going to be just about 3 minutes and then we'll come on back.
And I will be putting the question into the chat so you all remember what to discuss.
Thank you so much.
And then Jaimie, just for you, we had a question on if you had any good podcast recommendations.
Sure. I will write those down, and as people are in there, I obviously realize that answering it now is not useful.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for throwing that in the chat.
You got it.
I should be able to give them like a 1-minute warning.
Great.
So I'll kind of monitor that here.
Okay.
Because it looks like some people haven't joined. Either they've stopped listening or they just don't know what to do. But
couldn't sell them,
Yeah.
You lose some. You always lose
Technology has not been friendly today.
Yeah. No, that's perfectly okay. And after this, I know we ran a little short on question and answer. But after this, we just have one little mindful minute. We're not going to spend too much time with them, kind of not any debrief and there's discussions. And so we'll have a minute. I'm happy to stay on later or, give them my email and have them email me questions later.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think after Jaimie we'll wrap it up, and then I'll send a follow-up email with the recording and then any other information that you would like to pass along with them.
Great. Yeah, and that packet I'll send right after we're done here.
Awesome.
Thank you both so much. And you can go ahead and send the 1 minute warning out if you haven't already.
I just did, because once I hit close the rooms, it gives them like a minute to come back.
Great.
So
Great. If you just want to give me a thumbs up or a go for it when they're all back in, that would be great.
yep, I closed it, so they
Great.
they have to leave it, otherwise after a minute it kicks them out. So
Perfect.
hopefully people will jump back in here.
Great.
Sorry, my group, I cut myself off.
But there's only about 15 people.
Like we've got people filing back in slowly.
Okay.
There's no way you can end the breakout rooms.
Yep, everyone should be back in now. So you can remember to mute. Please remember to mute as you come back in.
Go play with something else. You have so much stuff to get out.
All right, everybody. So we just have about a minute left, and so I'm only going to use that minute to be mindful. I hope you all left here. You never know. Left those breakout groups. You really never know if someone may have just packed your parachute, or you just packed somebody else's for the upcoming winter break or the upcoming even week. So I appreciate you all engaging with each other. Hopefully, you got some really great ideas. And this final question I have, and you can just resonate on this for yourself, that last piece of mindfulness, that last skill at really changing mental health and engaging people and shifting their mood is hope. And so a question I love to ask student athletes, and I love to ask even coaches and everybody, is what is something you are looking forward to? Okay, it's sometimes not an easy question to ask, to be honest with you, or not an easy question to answer, but it's really effective and powerful at shifting somebody's attention into hope, into a place of hope. And you might become the new best instiller of hope in your team, in your student athletes, and even in yourself by asking just this question. So think about that for yourself. Hopefully that brings you off into your next whatever it is, and you're looking forward to that meeting, which I'm sure is another Zoom meeting. I want to be respectful of your time. I know it's 11. And so I'll be open. Like I said, you'll get a follow-up email, the recording, as well as that packet. I'm open to stay on for a few minutes and answer any questions if people do want to stay on. I know there was a question about podcasts that I love to answer, but if you have to go, please feel free to do so. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to anybody at Premier staff, but also myself. Here's my contact information. And thank you again so much for all being here and really committing to this much needed skill set and awareness.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jaimie.